Finally got the vacation we deserve, my daughter-in-law Christina had posted, flashing a diamond necklace and showing off their luxury Bahamas resort. The photos made my stomach turn. I knew exactly how they'd paid for that trip, with $18,600 from selling Martha's Rolex at a downtown pawn shop. That watch wasn't just jewelry. It was the first gift I'd given my wife after our wedding 34 years ago. Martha wore it every day until cancer took her 2 years back. My son Dylan knew what that watch meant to me, knew it was all I had left of her daily presence. But there he was, posting pictures of himself wearing a new gold Cartier, bought with money from betraying his grieving father's trust. I'm Travis Whitlock, retired insurance investigator, and I thought I'd taught my boy better than that. For 3 days, I sat in Martha's empty house, staring at the space where her jewelry box used to be, trying to process how my own son could steal from me while I was at Sunday service. The pawn shop receipt I found in his car told the whole story. Transaction completed at 10:47 a.m., right when he knew I'd be in church praying for Martha's soul. But here's what Dylan didn't know. When I drove to that pawn shop to buy back my wife's watch, the jeweler discovered something rattling inside the mechanism. Something Martha had hidden there before she died. What I found on that tiny memory card made me realize my wife had seen this betrayal coming long before I did. But before I tell you what Martha left for me to find, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family justice and quiet courage. Let me take you back to where this all started. I met Martha Sullivan at a church social in 1987. She was 23, working as an estate planner at Harrison and Associates downtown. I was 25, just starting out as an insurance investigator. What drew me to her wasn't just her smile. It was the way she listened, really listened. When people talked about their problems, Martha absorbed every detail, like she was building a case file in her mind. We married in 1989, and I'll never forget our wedding vows. Standing there in that little chapel, Martha looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I promise to guard your heart and your dreams, Travis, but I also promise to never let love become an excuse for enabling destruction." I didn't understand what she meant by that last part then. I thought it was just Martha being Martha, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always considering consequences. The Rolex came 3 months later. My first big case bonus, and I wanted to celebrate. "Something you'll wear every day," I told her as she opened that blue Tiffany box. "So you'll always remember this moment," she cried when she put it on, real tears. "It's perfect, Travis. I'll treasure it forever." And she did. 34 years, that watch never left her wrist except for surgeries and showers. Martha made me promise something that night I didn't understand until now. We were lying in bed, her new watch catching moonlight from the window. "Travis," she whispered, "if something ever happens to me, pay attention to what people do, not what they say. Character reveals itself under pressure. Promise me you'll remember that." I promised, thinking it was just pillow talk. I had no idea she was preparing me for a test I'd have to face decades later. Dylan came along in 1991, and from the start, Martha watched him like a hawk. Not in a controlling way. She was the most loving mother you could imagine, but she noticed patterns. When Dylan was 8, he'd take cookies from the jar without asking, then lie about it even when chocolate was smeared on his face. When he was 12, he'd borrow my tools and forget to return them. Martha would make him march those tools back to the garage himself, explaining why honesty mattered more than convenience. "Charm without character is dangerous, Travis," she'd tell me when I'd laugh off Dylan's little deceptions. "He's learning that his smile can get him out of consequences. That's not love. That's setting him up for failure." But Dylan was my boy, my only child. When he'd flash that grin and say, "Sorry, Dad," my heart would melt, and I'd ruffle his hair and move on. Martha saw what I refused to see. Dylan met Christina Morrison at a corporate mixer in 2018. She came from money, old Chicago money. Her father owned a string of medical device manufacturing plants. Her mother was on charity boards. Her 2 older brothers were a cardiologist, and a federal prosecutor. Christina herself worked in marketing, but it was more hobby than necessity. The family money meant she'd never really needed to worry about finances. The engagement in 2019 should have been happy, but I noticed Martha getting quieter during wedding planning. She'd sit at the kitchen table with her coffee, reviewing insurance policies and legal documents. Just updating things, she'd say when I asked, making sure everything's in order. I thought she was being practical. Martha had always been the organizer, the planner, the one who read every word of every contract. They married in 2020, right before the world went crazy with lockdowns. Small ceremony, Christina's family paying for most of it. I could see Dylan struggling with that. His new father-in-law picking up tabs, making offhand comments about taking care of the kids until they get established. Dylan's jaw would clench, but he'd smile and say thank you. After the wedding, Martha started spending evenings in her home office. Door closed, phone calls in hushed tones. When I asked about it, she'd say she was taking care of some business matters. I trusted her completely. Martha had handled our finances for 30 years, and we'd never had problems. She was meticulous about everything: insurance, investments, estate planning. I figured she was just being thorough. The night before she died, Martha gave me specific instructions about her jewelry. Travis, promise me something. If anyone ever takes my things without asking, especially my watch, don't just let it go. Get them back and look carefully at everything. Sometimes the most important messages come in the smallest packages. And she was weak then, the cancer having taken so much, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Promise me you'll be strong enough to do what's right, even when it hurts. I promised, holding her hand as that familiar Rolex ticked steadily on her wrist. 12 hours later, she was gone, and I thought my world had ended. I had no idea she'd actually saved it. The funeral was on a Thursday. By Saturday, Dylan was asking for money. "Dad, I know this is hard timing," he said, standing in my kitchen like he'd rather be anywhere else. "But Christina's car broke down, and the transmission's shot. We need 8,000 for repairs." He had that look, the same one he'd had as a kid when he wanted something. Hopeful but nervous, like he was testing boundaries. I was still in shock, still wearing the same clothes from 2 days earlier, still expecting Martha to walk through the door and tell me this was all a mistake. Writing that check felt automatic. Dylan was grieving too, right? He needed support. "Thanks, Dad. We really appreciate it." He was gone 15 minutes later, every time I wrote the check. 2 weeks later, "Dad, I hate to ask, but we've got this business opportunity. Christina knows someone's starting a consulting firm, and if we can invest 12,000, we'll be partners. It's a sure thing." I found out later there was no consulting firm. Dylan had lost the money, gambling on crypto trading, chasing some get-rich-quick scheme he'd seen on YouTube. A month after that, "Christina's been having health issues, specialists, tests, you know how insurance is. We need 6,500 to cover the medical bills." The health issues turned out to be spa treatments and cosmetic procedures. Dylan had used my grief money to help his wife look good for her friends. Each time I told myself I was being a good father. Martha was gone, Dylan was struggling. And wasn't this what family did? Support each other? But deep down, something felt wrong. The requests were always urgent, always exactly the amount Dylan needed. Never a dollar more or less. And he never offered updates on how things worked out. Never mentioned paying anything back. Every time I said yes, I'd tell Martha's picture some nights, sitting in the living room where we used to watch the news together, but I was building something dangerous. The pattern continued for months. Dylan would call or visit, always with Christina's encouraging smile in the background, always with a story that tugged at my heartstrings. His transmission, her medical bills, a business opportunity, emergency repairs, a friend in need. By Christmas 2023, I'd given them over $37,000. Not loans, gifts. Dylan never called them loans, and I never asked for repayment schedules. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was how Dylan changed. Each request came with less explanation, less gratitude, more entitlement. The last time when he asked for $25,000 for some investment opportunity, And I finally said no. His whole demeanor shifted. Dad, you're sitting on Mom's life insurance money doing nothing. Christina and I are trying to build a future here. We're young, we've got opportunities you don't understand. That money's just going to sit in your bank account until you die anyway. The coldness in his voice shocked me. This wasn't grief talking. This wasn't a son asking his father for help. This was someone calculating inheritance, timelines, measuring my remaining useful life against his immediate wants. Son, that money is for my security. Your mother and I saved for 30 years. Mom's gone, Dad. You need to accept that and start living in the present. That night, I sat in Martha's home office, surrounded by her carefully organized files. Insurance policies, investment statements, tax documents, everything labeled and cross-referenced in her precise handwriting. I'd avoided this room since her death, but something made me start looking through her papers. That's when I discovered the separate bank account. 30 years of automatic deductions I'd never noticed. Premium payments to Consolidated Life Insurance for a policy worth $2.8 million. Martha had been paying for this policy since 1994, the year after Dylan was born. The beneficiary forms were missing from the file, but there were handwritten notes in Martha's writing. Character clause activated by family theft. Moral conditions documented. Protection protocol established. I called the insurance company the next morning. Mr. Whitlock, yes, we've been expecting your call. Mrs. Whitlock updated her policy extensively in her final weeks. However, I can't discuss the details over the phone. We'll need to schedule an appointment. The agent, Mrs. Patterson, was professional but mysterious. Your wife was very specific about the conditions of this policy. She wanted to ensure certain safeguards were in place. I can tell you that she made recent changes to the beneficiary arrangements, but the full details are sealed until specific conditions are met. What kind of conditions? I'm not at liberty to say, Mr. Whitlock. Mrs. Whitlock was very clear about that, but she did mention you'd understand when the time was right. I drove home confused and a little angry. Why would Martha keep such a massive financial secret? Why the mystery about beneficiary changes? What conditions was she talking about? I spent the evening going through more of her papers, finding insurance investigation reports from her early career, legal briefs about family inheritance disputes, case studies about moral character clauses in estate planning. Martha had been preparing for something. But what? The answer came 6 weeks later, in the form of an Instagram post that made my blood boil and broke my heart at the same time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What you need to understand is this. By the time Dylan stole Martha's watch, I'd already given him enough money to buy a decent used car. I'd already proven that my love came without conditions, without expectations, without accountability. I'd shown him that grief made me vulnerable, that his mother's death had left me emotionally defenseless. Martha had seen this coming. In those final weeks, while I was focused on medicines and doctor appointments and making her comfortable, she was building a fortress around our family's future. She was documenting every dollar I'd already given Dylan, every excuse he'd made, every promise he'd broken. She knew exactly what kind of man our son was becoming, and she'd prepared for the day when I'd finally see it too. The first real warning sign came that spring. Dylan stopped visiting unless he needed something. Used to be, he'd drop by on Sunday afternoons, maybe catch a baseball game on TV or help me with yard work. After Martha died, those visits became phone calls. Then the phone calls became texts. Then the texts only came when he needed money. When he did visit, everything felt transactional. He'd walk through the house like he was cataloging inventory, making comments about how outdated everything looked. Dad, you've been sleeping on the same mattress for 15 years. Mom would want you to be comfortable. Or, this kitchen is from the 80s. When are you going to renovate? The criticism stung because Dylan positioned it as concern for my well-being, but it felt more like impatience with my spending habits. Why wasn't I upgrading everything? Why was I hoarding money instead of enjoying it? The subtext was always the same. I was wasting resources he could be using. But I kept hoping he'd change. And then came Easter dinner at Christina's parents' house in Lake Forest. The Morrison family had money, and they weren't shy about showing it. The house was one of those sprawling suburban monuments with a circular driveway and professionally maintained landscaping. Christina's mother, Patricia, greeted us wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my annual property taxes. Her father, Robert, had the kind of confident handshake that said he'd spent decades closing million-dollar deals. Dinner was formal, real china, crystal glasses, place cards for 8 people. Christina's brothers, Michael and James, were there with their wives. Michael, the cardiologist, drove a Tesla and talked about his new practice. James, the prosecutor, owned property in Aspen and was planning a summer trip to Europe. Both men had that easy confidence that comes from inherited success and professional achievement. Dylan tried to keep up. He talked about business opportunities and investment strategies, using terms I could tell he didn't fully understand. Christina smiled supportively, but I could see the strain around her eyes. She knew her husband was performing, trying to impress people who'd grown up with advantages he was still reaching for. The conversation turned to careers, accomplishments, financial planning. Michael mentioned buying his third rental property. James talked about his kids' private school tuition. Both men spoke casually about numbers that represented years of Dylan's salary. Dylan's been exploring some exciting opportunities, Christina said during a lull in conversation, her voice slightly too bright. Tell them about the consulting thing. Dylan's face flushed. The consulting thing had fallen through months ago, if it had ever existed at all. Well, that's still developing. These things take time. He glanced at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Shame mixed with resentment. He was embarrassed by his own life, and somehow that embarrassment was my fault. Robert Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Dylan with the calculating look of a man who'd spent decades evaluating business proposals. Time, yes, but also capital. These opportunities you mentioned, do you have the resources to move on them? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dylan's jaw tightened. Christina touched his arm, a warning gesture, but he ignored it. Actually, my family has significant assets. My father's very comfortable financially. We're just being strategic about timing. I felt my face get hot. Dylan was using Martha's death, using my financial security as a shield against his own inadequacy. He was turning my years of careful saving into his credibility story. That's smart, Patricia said smoothly. Family money can be such a blessing when young couples are getting established. Absolutely, Dylan said, warming to his theme. Dad's been incredibly generous. Sometimes I have to convince him to slow down. He wants to help more than we can even accept. Complete lies. I hadn't offered anything Dylan hadn't asked for first, but suddenly I was the wealthy father choosing to support his struggling son, instead of the grieving widower being systematically drained by someone who viewed my loss as his opportunity. I watched my son create an entire fictional narrative about our relationship, and I said nothing. I was too shocked, too confused by this version of myself that Dylan was presenting. In his story, I was the generous patriarch distributing family wealth. In reality, I was a man whose grief had made him an easy target for manipulation. The drive home was silent. Christina stared out the window. Dylan gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. I saw Dylan's face change that night. The second escalation came 2 weeks later. Dylan showed up at my house on a Wednesday evening. No advance warning, no phone call. He walked into my living room like he owned the place and sat down across from me with the kind of determined expression that meant he'd been planning this conversation. Dad, we need to talk about Mom's things. What about them? They're just sitting here. Her jewelry, her clothes, her personal stuff. It's like a museum. Christina thinks, we both think, it's not healthy for you to be surrounded by all this grief. I could feel my chest tightening. Those things bring me comfort, son. Dad, Mom's gone. She's not coming back. Keeping all her stuff isn't going to change that. And honestly, some of those pieces could really help Christina and me right now. Christina's had her eye on Mom's pearl necklace, and that Rolex is just sitting in a box doing nobody any good. The audacity of it stunned me. Martha had been dead less than a year, and Dylan was already dividing up her possessions like we were closing an estate sale. Son, I'm not ready to. When will you be ready, Dad? Next year? 5 years? 10 years? At some point, you have to accept reality. Mom would want her things to be used, not locked away like trophies. The manipulation was so smooth, I almost fell for it. Dylan was reframing his greed as concern for my emotional health and respect for Martha's wishes. He was making me the unreasonable one for wanting to keep my dead wife's belongings. I said no, Dylan. His expression shifted. The concerned sun mask slipped, and for just a moment, I saw cold calculation underneath. Fine, but this isn't over. Christina deserves better than watching her husband's family hoard resources while we struggle. He left without saying goodbye, and I sat in that living room for 2 hours, shaking. Not from sadness, from anger. Dylan had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. He'd turned my grief into his inconvenience, my love for Martha into my character flaw. I should have seen what was coming. The third escalation was the worst. Memorial Day weekend, Dylan and Christina threw a barbecue at their apartment complex. Extended family, some friends, neighbors, maybe 20 people total. I brought potato salad and tried to blend into the background, still processing our conversation about Martha's jewelry. The party was going fine until Robert Morrison arrived. Christina's father commanded attention without trying, and soon everyone was gathered around the pool, listening to his stories about business deals and family vacations. Someone mentioned the Morrison family's upcoming trip to Italy. 3 weeks, rented villa, whole extended family. Must be nice, one of Dylan's friends said. I can barely afford a weekend at the Wisconsin Dells. Robert laughed. Well, life's about priorities. Patricia and I decided early on that experiences matter more than things. We'd rather create memories than accumulate possessions. Dylan's face darkened. I could see him calculating. Robert's casual dismissal of cost, his effortless superiority, his assumption that everyone could simply choose experiences over financial constraints. Actually, Dylan said, his voice carrying across the pool area, my family understands that too. My dad's been talking about taking us all on a big trip. Bahamas, maybe. Something to honor Mom's memory. Every eye turned to me. I felt my mouth go dry. I hadn't mentioned any such trip. I hadn't even thought about traveling since Martha's death. How wonderful, Patricia said. Travel can be so healing after loss. When are you thinking? Christina asked, and I could hear genuine excitement in her voice. She believed Dylan. She thought this trip was real. Still planning, Dylan said quickly. Dad's being generous, as usual. Sometimes I worry he spoils us too much. There it was again. The fictional narrative where I was the benefactor and Dylan was the grateful recipient. But this time, he'd created expectations. Christina was already mentally packing for the Bahamas. Her parents were nodding approvingly about my generosity. Dylan had committed me to an expensive vacation I couldn't afford and didn't want, using Martha's memory as justification. I stayed quiet through the rest of the party, watching my son dig himself deeper into lies, while his wife and her family made plans around his promises. When I got home that night, I sat in Martha's office and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I calculated exactly how much money Dylan had taken from me since his mother's death. $43,800. In 11 months, my son had extracted nearly $50,000 from my savings. Money. Martha and I had put away for emergencies, for medical care, for the security that comes from knowing you won't be a burden on your children in old age. Dylan had turned my love into his ATM, and now he was promising expensive vacations with money I didn't have, using his dead mother's memory as leverage. He started looking at Mom's jewelry box differently. That's when I knew something fundamental had changed in my son. The boy who used to help Martha in the garden, who used to call every Sunday just to check in, who used to care about things beyond money. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who saw his father as a financial resource and his mother's death as a business opportunity. The anniversary dinner was coming up in 2 weeks. Christina's parents' 30th wedding anniversary. Another family gathering. Another opportunity for Dylan to perform wealth he didn't have using money he hadn't earned. But by then, Martha's Rolex would already be gone. The anniversary dinner was held at Le Bernardin, one of those Chicago restaurants where entrees start at $60, and you need reservations 3 months in advance. Patricia Morrison had chosen it specifically because it was Robert's favorite, the place where he'd proposed 30 years earlier. I dressed carefully that night, wearing the navy suit Martha had bought me for Dylan's wedding. She'd said it brought out my eyes. I missed having her there to straighten my tie, to tell me I looked handsome, to squeeze my hand in the car, and remind me that these fancy dinners weren't really about the food. Dylan and Christina arrived 15 minutes late, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how different they looked. Christina wore a new dress, something sleek and expensive that I'd never seen before. Dylan had a fresh haircut and new shoes, the kind of leather Oxfords that cost more than my monthly electric bill. They moved through the restaurant with a confidence that seemed forced, like actors playing roles they hadn't quite mastered yet. I could feel the tension building. Robert had reserved a private dining room, circular table for 8. The Morrison family filled half the seats. Robert and Patricia, sons Michael and James with their wives Sarah and Jennifer. Dylan, Christina, and I completed the circle. The room felt intimate and intimidating at the same time, with soft lighting and oil paintings that probably cost more than my car. Conversation flowed easily among the Morrison clan. They had that comfortable rhythm of people who'd shared thousands of meals together, who understood each other's references and finished each other's sentences. Michael talked about his medical practice expansion. James mentioned a case he was prosecuting. The wives discussed their children's activities with the casual expertise of women whose biggest concern was choosing between piano lessons and soccer practice. Dylan tried to contribute, sharing stories about his sales job that he'd embellished to sound more impressive than they were. He talked about major clients and breakthrough deals, but I could hear the strain in his voice. He was performing for an audience that didn't really need him to perform, which made the act even more obvious. Christina played her part perfectly, smiling and nodding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions that made Dylan's stories sound more important than they were. But I caught her glancing at her parents' faces, gauging their reactions, measuring their approval. The first course arrived, some kind of seafood appetizer, arranged like artwork on white porcelain. Everyone made appropriate, appreciative sounds. Robert ordered wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The conversation turned to family updates, vacation plans, investment strategies. Then Christina's father stood up for a toast. Robert Morrison rose with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. He held his wine glass like a scepter, waiting for complete attention before speaking. 30 years ago tonight, I asked Patricia to marry me in this very restaurant. I was 28, scared to death, and convinced I was the luckiest man alive. 3 decades later, I'm still scared to death. But now it's because I know how many ways I could have screwed this up. Gentle laughter around the table. Patricia touched his hand, her diamond wedding ring catching the candlelight. Patricia and I have been blessed with 3 beautiful children and 6 grandchildren. We've built a business, traveled the world, and created a family legacy we're proud of. But tonight, I want to talk about the future. He gestured toward his sons and their wives. Michael and James have exceeded every expectation Patricia and I ever had. They've built careers, raised families, and become the kind of men who make their parents proud. They've shown us that success isn't just about achievement. It's about character, responsibility, and the commitment to provide for the people you love. I felt Dylan shifting beside me, his jaw tightening. Christina's face was perfectly composed, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Which brings me to our newest family member. Robert's gaze moved to Dylan, and the room fell silent. Christina married for love, which Patricia and I support completely, but love alone doesn't pay mortgages or raise children or build the kind of security that marriage requires. The pause stretched uncomfortably. Dylan's breathing had become shallow, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. So I have a question for you, Dylan. Christina's been married to you for 3 years now. She's 30 years old. Her biological clock is ticking, and her friends are buying houses and starting families. When are you going to step up and provide for my daughter the way she deserves? When are you going to stop letting your father subsidize your lifestyle and start acting like a man? I watched my son's face crumble. The silence that followed was devastating. Every person at that table was staring at Dylan, waiting for his response. Christina looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Patricia's face showed genuine sympathy, but also expectation. The brothers-in-law exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their private conversations regarding Dylan's fitness as a husband. Dylan's face went through a series of changes: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked like desperate calculation. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, you don't know what you're talking about." Robert's eyebrows raised. "Excuse me? My family has resources you don't understand. My father has been generous, yes, but not because I can't provide for Christina, because that's what families do. They support each other. And actually," Dylan's voice was getting stronger now, fed by humiliation and rage, "we're going to the Bahamas next month. 5-star resort, everything first class. Maybe you'd like to join us, since you're so concerned about my ability to provide experiences." Christina's eyes went wide. This was the first she was hearing about confirmed travel plans. I felt my stomach drop, realizing that Dylan was making commitments he couldn't keep, using money that didn't exist. "The Bahamas?" Patricia said, genuinely interested. "How wonderful! Which resort?" Dylan rattled off details he'd clearly researched: the Cove at Atlantis, Ocean View Suite, private beach access. Every word was another step deeper into a hole he was digging with borrowed credibility. "That sounds lovely," Robert said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "And you're comfortable with that expense?" "Absolutely. Like I said, my family understands the value of experiences. My mother always wanted to travel more before she got sick. This trip is partly in her honor." Using Martha's memory to justify fictional vacation plans was the final straw. I wanted to speak up, to stop this performance before it got completely out of hand. But I was frozen by the social dynamics, by my own confusion about what Dylan was actually planning, by the horrible possibility that he might be counting on money I didn't have. The dinner continued for another hour, but the damage was done. Dylan had committed himself to proving his worth through expensive gestures he couldn't afford. Christina was now anticipating a vacation that didn't exist. Robert Morrison was watching my son with the calculating interest of a predator who'd identified wounded prey. He looked at me with something I'd never seen before. When we said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot, Dylan pulled me aside. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the Bahamas trip." "What Bahamas trip? You never mentioned any—" "The one I just told Christina's family about. The one that's going to prove I can provide for my wife without her father treating me like some kind of charity case." "Dylan, I never agreed to—" "Dad, I need this. Christina needs this. You heard what her father said. He thinks I'm some kind of loser who can't take care of his own family. This trip is going to shut him up permanently." I could see the desperation in his eyes, the humiliation that was driving him toward increasingly bad decisions. "Son, I understand you're hurt, but we can't afford—" "We can't afford it? Dad, you've got Mom's life insurance money sitting in the bank doing nothing. You've got savings you haven't touched in years. You're sitting on resources while your son gets humiliated by his in-laws. That money is for my security, Dylan, for my old age, for medical emergencies. You're 67 years old, Dad. How long are you planning to live? What's the point of having all that money if you won't spend it on family?" The coldness in his voice shocked me. Dylan was calculating my life expectancy like an actuarial table, measuring my remaining years against his immediate wants. "I need $15,000 by Friday, Dad. Christina's already told her friends about the trip. I've already booked the flights. This is happening." "I can't give you $15,000, Dylan." "Then I'll figure something else out." He walked away without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in that parking lot with the horrible certainty that my son was about to make a decision that would change everything between us forever. By morning, my wife's watch was gone. I found the empty jewelry box Sunday afternoon, after returning from church. The lock had been forced, not picked. Dylan had used something like a screwdriver to pry it open, leaving gouges in the antique wood. Martha's pearl necklace was still there. Her wedding ring was still there, but the Rolex was gone. Along with it was a handwritten note. Dad, I'm borrowing this for collateral. We'll pay you back after the trip. This is important for my marriage. You'll understand someday. Dylan. Collateral. He'd reduced his mother's most precious possession to a financial instrument. He'd stolen from his grieving father and called it borrowing. He'd broken into the one place I'd kept sacred since Martha's death, violated the last physical connection I had to my wife's daily presence. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, holding that violated jewelry box, understanding for the first time what Martha had meant when she warned me about enabling destruction. My love for Dylan had become the weapon he used against me. My grief had made me vulnerable to manipulation. My desire to be a good father had turned me into an easy target for someone who saw my generosity as weakness. But Martha had seen this coming. In those final weeks, while I was focused on losing her, she was focused on protecting me from the son we'd raised together. The jeweler's eyes widened when I told him what I'd found. That Sunday night, I sat alone in Martha's favorite chair, staring at the empty space where her jewelry box had been. The silence in the house felt different. Not peaceful like it usually was, but violated. Someone had been here without permission, taken something precious without asking, left destruction in their wake. I picked up Martha's framed photo from the side table, the one from our last anniversary before she got sick. She was wearing the Rolex in that picture, laughing at something I'd said while we posed outside the restaurant where we'd had our first date. Her wrist looked so small under that watch band, but she'd worn it with such pride. "It makes me feel elegant," she used to say, "like I'm someone worth giving beautiful things to." Martha's voice seemed to guide me. For 3 hours, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to call Dylan immediately, demand the watch back, threaten to call the police if necessary. But another part of me, the father part that had been making excuses for Dylan's behavior for years, wondered if I should just let it go. Maybe he really would return it after the trip. Maybe this was just desperation, not malice. Maybe I was overreacting to what was essentially a family loan using family property as collateral. But then I remembered Martha's words. Pay attention to what people do, not what they say. Character reveals itself under pressure. Dylan's character was revealing itself. When pressured by his father-in-law's criticism, when faced with the choice between honest conversation about financial limitations or stolen wealth to maintain appearances, he'd chosen theft. When confronted with the option of disappointing his wife or violating his father's trust, he'd chosen violation. This wasn't about a watch. This was about who my son was becoming. By midnight, I'd made my decision. I was going to get Martha's watch back, no matter what it cost. Not because of its monetary value, though $18,000 was more than many people made in a year, but because it represented something Dylan had no right to take. 34 years of marriage. Daily proof of a love that had lasted until death. The last tangible piece of Martha I had left. Monday morning, I called the pawn shop. Prestige Loans, this is Marcus. My name is Travis Whitlock. My son sold you a Rolex yesterday. 1987 Submariner. I want to buy it back. The pause. Sir, I'll need to check our records. Can you hold for a moment? While I waited, I calculated how much cash I had immediately available. Checking account, savings account, the emergency fund Martha and I had maintained for decades. If I liquidated everything except my retirement accounts, I could probably come up with $25,000. Maybe 30 if I pushed it. Mr. Whitlock? Yes, I have the record here. 1987 Rolex Submariner, sold yesterday morning for $18,600. Are you looking to redeem this item? How does that work? Well, sir, normally the person who pawned the item has 30 days to redeem it by paying back the loan plus interest. But if you're a family member and you can provide identification proving relationship, we can work with you. How much? for immediate redemption, $20,000 cash. That covers the loan amount plus fees and interest. $20,000. More than Dylan had received, but that was how pawn shops worked. They paid wholesale and charged retail, making profit on both ends of the transaction. I'll be there this afternoon. Sir, there is one thing. The watch appears to have some kind of internal issue, something loose inside the mechanism. We'd normally send it for evaluation before final sale, but if you're redeeming it immediately, that's your call. I called the pawn shop first thing Monday. Something loose inside the mechanism. My hands started shaking as I hung up the phone. Martha had been meticulous about maintaining that watch. She'd had it serviced annually, cleaned professionally, treated it like the precious gift it was. If something was rattling inside, it wasn't from normal wear. It was intentional. I spent the morning gathering cash from 3 different banks, closing out accounts I'd maintained for decades. The bank managers were concerned. Elderly man liquidating assets was often a sign of financial fraud or family manipulation. I had to explain 3 times that this was my decision, my money, my choice. By 2 p.m., I was standing in prestige loans with $20,000 in hundreds and fifties spread across the counter. The pawnbroker, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and careful hands, examined each bill with a UV light before counting them into neat stacks. There we go, Mr. Whitlock. 20,000 even. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small box. Your wife's watch. I opened the box with trembling fingers. There it was, Martha's Rolex, looking smaller and more delicate than I remembered. The silver band was slightly tarnished. The crystal face had a few microscopic scratches, but it was unmistakably hers. I could almost smell her perfume on the metal. But there was a problem with the mechanism. You mentioned something rattling inside? Yeah, here, listen. He held the watch near my ear and shook it gently. Something definitely moved inside the case. Something that didn't belong in a precision timepiece. I'd recommend taking it to a jeweler before wearing it. Could be a loose spring, could be something more serious. Don't want to damage the movement. I drove straight to Whitman's Jewelry, the place where I'd bought Martha's watch 34 years earlier. Old Mr. Whitman had retired, but his son David had taken over the business and remembered my family. Mr. Whitlock, I was sorry to hear about Martha. She was a lovely woman. How can I help you today? I explained the situation, not the theft part, just that the watch had developed an internal rattle and needed examination. David took the Rolex into the back room, and I sat in the customer chair where Martha used to sit when we'd come in for maintenance appointments. 15 minutes later, David returned with an expression I couldn't read. Mr. Whitlock, I need to ask you something, and please don't take this the wrong way. Did Martha ever mention hiding anything inside this watch? My mouth went dry. What do you mean? Well, the mechanism is fine, keeping perfect time, all the parts intact. But there's a micro SD card sealed in a waterproof case that's been installed inside the caseback. It's held in place with surgical adhesive. This took serious planning and precision work. What I found on that card changed everything. David handed me the tiny SD card, smaller than my thumbnail. I've never seen anything like it. The installation must have been done by someone with access to sophisticated jewelry tools and knowledge of watch construction. This isn't something you could do at home. I stared at that tiny piece of technology, understanding that Martha had planned this moment months before it happened. She'd known Dylan would eventually cross the line. She'd known I would need to retrieve her watch. She'd known exactly what would happen when I did. David, can you show me what's on this card? I don't have the right equipment here, but any computer with an SD card reader should work. I drove home in a daze, clutching that micro SD card, like it was a message in a bottle from my dead wife. Martha had hidden something inside her most precious possession, something meant for me to find when Dylan's character finally revealed itself completely. Whatever was on that card was going to change everything. At home, I sat in Martha's office with her laptop and that tiny SD card, my hands shaking as I inserted it into the card reader. The computer made a soft chime, and a folder appeared on the screen labeled, "For Travis, when you're ready to see." Inside were 3 files. a video file marked Watch This First, a PDF called Insurance Documents Critical, and another video labeled Final Message. I clicked on the first video, and suddenly Martha's face filled the screen. She looked tired. This had clearly been recorded during her final weeks, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She was sitting in the same chair, in the same room, speaking directly to the camera, with the kind of calm precision I'd always associated with her professional work. Travis, honey, if you're watching this, it means Dylan took my watch. I know this is hard for you to hear, but I need you to understand something important. This isn't the first time our son has stolen from us. Martha predicted this exact scenario. The video continued for 12 minutes. Martha explained how she'd discovered Dylan taking money from her purse during her cancer treatments. $20 here, $50 there, always when she was too weak to notice immediately. She'd started marking bills, tracking serial numbers, setting up small tests. Dylan had failed every one. I found evidence that he'd been taking money from my medical fund, money you thought was going to doctors and treatments. He was stealing from his dying mother, Travis, and when I confronted him about it, he didn't show remorse. He showed anger at being caught. My chest felt tight. I remembered those weeks when Martha was too sick to handle finances herself, when I'd been overwhelmed with caregiving responsibilities. I'd given Dylan access to some accounts to help with medical bills. I'd trusted him with money meant to keep his mother alive. I hired a private investigator, honey. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I needed to understand the scope of this problem. Dylan has gambling debts we don't know about. He's been lying to Christina about his income. He's been using our financial support to maintain a lifestyle he can't afford, while telling his wife's family that we're supporting them out of generosity rather than necessity. The video showed documents, credit card statements, bank records, surveillance photos of Dylan at casino tables. Martha had documented everything with the thoroughness of the estate planning professional she'd been. But here's the most important part, Travis. I've prepared for this moment. I've created legal protections that will activate when Dylan demonstrates that his character is fundamentally compromised. The camera switched to show documents spread across her desk. I've updated my life insurance policy with a moral character clause. If Dylan commits theft from family members, he'll be automatically disqualified as a beneficiary. The money will go instead to a charitable trust I've established. Legal mechanism explained. I paused the video, my hands shaking. $2.8 million. Dylan didn't even know the money existed, and by stealing Martha's watch, he'd forfeited any claim to it. The second file contained scanned documents, insurance policy amendments, legal affidavits, witness statements from the private investigator. Everything was dated, notarized, and organized with Martha's characteristic attention to detail. The moral character clause was ironclad. Beneficiary status is void upon documented theft from policyholders' immediate family members. The legal language was clear. Dylan's theft of the watch, documented by the pawnshop receipt, timestamped and witnessed, had automatically triggered the clause. The money was no longer his, even theoretically. I called the insurance company immediately. Consolidated Life Insurance Claims Department, this is Janet. This is Travis Whitlock. Policy number 8529-1994. I need to report an event that affects beneficiary status. One moment, sir. Pause. Mr. Whitlock, yes, I see your file here. Ms. Whitlock gave us specific instructions about this policy. You're calling to report activation of the moral character clause? Yes. I have documentation of theft from a family member by the primary beneficiary. Can you transmit that documentation electronically? Within an hour, I'd scanned and submitted the pawnshop receipt, Dylan's handwritten note claiming he was borrowing the watch, and photographic evidence of the forced jewelry box. The insurance company's response was swift and professional. Mr. Whitlock, the moral character clause has been activated. Beneficiary transfer to the Martha Whitlock Charitable Trust will be completed within 72 hours. You'll receive confirmation documents by email and physical mail. Charity notification process initiated. I hung up the phone and immediately called our family attorney, Richard Patterson. I'd known Dick for 20 years. He'd handled our wills, our house purchases, all the legal paperwork that goes with building a life together. Travis, I wondered when you'd call. Martha asked me to prepare some additional documents for you, sealed until specific conditions were met. I believe those conditions have now been met. Dick, did you know about all of this? I knew Martha was concerned about Dylan's behavior patterns. She asked me to create some protective legal structures. I prepared them, but I hoped you'd never need them. What else did she arrange? Well, Martha updated your will to prevent any future claims against your estate. She established a trust structure that protects your remaining assets from manipulation, and she prepared a formal cease and desist template in case Dylan attempts to contest the insurance decision. Additional protections activated. Dick's office sent over documents I'd never seen before, amendments to my will that I'd somehow missed signing, trust paperwork that redirected assets away from Dylan, legal frameworks that protected me from exactly the kind of financial manipulation I'd been experiencing for months. Travis, Martha was thinking 10 moves ahead. She knew that Dylan would escalate his demands once he realized the insurance money was gone. She wanted to make sure he couldn't pressure you into giving him access to your remaining resources. The legal documentation was comprehensive. Dylan would have no claim on my house, my retirement accounts, or any other assets. If he tried to challenge the insurance decision, he'd face legal fees he couldn't afford. If he attempted to manipulate or threaten me, restraining orders were already prepared. Martha hadn't just protected our family's money. She'd protected me from our own son. But there was still the final video to watch. I returned to her office and clicked on Final Message. This recording was different. Martha looked even more tired, but also somehow peaceful. She was wearing her nightgown and the Rolex. This had clearly been filmed very close to her death. Travis, if you're watching this, it means everything has played out exactly as I expected it would. I know this is painful, honey. I know you wanted to believe Dylan would choose family over greed, but sometimes love means accepting difficult truths about the people we care about most. Now I had to tell Dylan the truth. I've spent the last year watching our son become someone I don't recognize. The lies, the manipulation, the sense of entitlement, these aren't temporary problems caused by financial stress. This is who Dylan has chosen to be. And if we keep enabling it, we're not helping him. We're destroying him. Martha leaned forward, speaking directly into the camera. The insurance money isn't gone, Travis. It's doing exactly what money should do, helping children who need medical care, supporting families who are fighting the same battles we fought. Dylan's greed created something beautiful for people who deserve help. I want you to understand that this isn't punishment. This is consequences. Dylan made choices, and choices have results. The most loving thing we can do now is let him experience those results completely. The video ended with Martha removing her watch and looking at it sadly. This watch represents 34 years of love, Travis. Don't let anyone make it represent anything less. I sat in that office for an hour after the video ended, processing everything Martha had done. While I'd been focused on daily caregiving and emotional support during her illness, she'd been conducting a comprehensive investigation of our son's character. While I'd been hoping Dylan would improve with maturity and support, she'd been preparing for the reality that he wouldn't. She'd seen clearly what I'd been too loving to see. Dylan had become someone who would steal from his dying mother and his grieving father without remorse. But she'd also seen me clearly. She'd known I would need protection from my own generous impulses, that I would struggle to set boundaries with someone I'd loved unconditionally since birth. The phone call I had to make to Dylan wasn't going to be easy, but Martha had given me everything I needed to make it from a position of strength rather than weakness. For the first time since her death, I felt like I could hear her voice clearly, and she was telling me exactly what needed to happen next. I waited until Tuesday evening to call Dylan. He would be back from the Bahamas by then, probably dealing with the reality of credit card bills and the return to normal life. I wanted him to have a day to process whatever had happened during that trip before he had to process what was about to happen to the rest of his life. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Dad, I was going to call you. Look, about the watch." "Dylan, I need you to stop talking and listen carefully. I got the watch back. Silence. I know you sold it to Prestige Loans for $18,600. I paid $20,000 to redeem it yesterday. Dad, I can explain. I said stop talking. When I took the watch to the jeweler, we found something your mother had hidden inside it before she died. A micro SD card with video messages and legal documents. I could hear Dylan breathing, but he said nothing. Your mother knew you would eventually steal from me, son. She documented the money you took from her purse during her cancer treatments. She hired a private investigator to track your gambling debts. She prepared legal protections that would activate if you ever crossed the line from asking for money to taking it without permission. Then I told him about the insurance policy. More silence. Then, what are you talking about? What insurance policy? Your mother maintained a life insurance policy worth $2.8 million for 30 years. You were the primary beneficiary, but the policy included a moral character clause that automatically disqualifies beneficiaries who commit theft from family members. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Dylan? 2.8 million? His voice was barely a whisper. Yes, money your mother saved and invested and protected for 3 decades. Money that would have secured your future, paid for a house, funded Christina's dreams, provided for the grandchildren we hoped you'd give us someday. I could hear something that might have been crying, or maybe just struggling to breathe. But by stealing her watch, you triggered the moral character clause. The money automatically transferred to a charitable trust yesterday. It's gone, Dylan. All of it. Silence as Dylan processes $2. 8 million loss. The sound that came through the phone then was unlike anything I'd ever heard from my son. It wasn't crying. It was the kind of primal sound people make when they realize they've destroyed their own lives through their own choices. Dad, I didn't know. I can fix this. I can pay you back for the watch. You can't fix this, son. Legal documents have already been filed. The charity has already been notified. This isn't about the watch anymore. It's about who you've become. But I can change. I'll go to counseling. I'll pay you back everything. Dylan, your mother gave you dozens of chances to change. Every time you took money from her purse, every time you lied about what you needed money for, every time you manipulated my grief to get what you wanted, those were opportunities to choose differently. I could hear Christina in the background now, her voice rising as she presumably learned about the conversation and its implications. What does this mean for me, Dad? For my finances, for my... It means you're going to have to figure out how to build a life without my financial support. It means you're going to have to explain to Christina how you gambled away nearly $3 million by stealing your mother's watch for vacation money. Frantic attempts to justify theft. Dad, please, you have to understand. Christina's family was treating me like garbage. Her father humiliated me in front of everyone. I needed to show them I could provide for her, that I wasn't some charity case. So you made me the charity case instead? You turned your dying mother's jewelry into your vacation fund? I was going to pay you back. With what money, Dylan? You don't have $18,000. You've never had $18,000 of your own. Every significant purchase you've made in the last 3 years has been funded by money you took from your grieving father. And the reality of it hung between us like a physical presence. Dylan had been living a borrowed life, using my resources to maintain appearances he couldn't afford, and now both the resources and the appearances were gone. Final boundary establishment. Dad, what happens now? Now you learn to live within your means. Now you figure out how to be a husband without your father's money subsidizing your marriage. Now you discover what kind of man you actually are when you can't use other people's resources to fake being successful. Are you cutting me off completely? Your mother's insurance money is gone. That's a legal fact, not my decision. My financial support stops today. That's my decision. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it's going to be based on who you are, not what I can give you. But Dad, I'm your son. You're a 32-year-old man who stole from his dying mother and his grieving father. Being my son didn't stop you from betraying me, and it's not going to save you from the consequences now. Christina's voice was getting louder in the background. I could hear what sounded like things being thrown. You chose money over family, Dylan, Every time you had to decide between honesty and manipulation, between earning and taking, between respecting boundaries and violating trust, you chose wrong. Now you get to live with those choices. The call ended with my son crying, "Dad, please!" I hung up the phone. For the first time since Martha's death, the house felt peaceful instead of empty. I'd finally stopped enabling the destruction of my son's character. I'd finally honored my wife's wisdom instead of my own wishful thinking. Martha had been right about everything. Love without boundaries wasn't love. It was enabling. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was let someone face the full consequences of their choices. The phone rang 6 more times that evening. I didn't answer it. The first sign that Dylan's world was crumbling came through social media. Christina's Instagram account, which had been full of Bahamas vacation photos just days earlier, went completely silent. Then the photos started disappearing. First the resort pictures, then the jewelry shots, then anything that suggested wealth or luxury lifestyle. The facade was crumbling. Within a week, I started hearing things through our small network of mutual acquaintances. Dylan and Christina had cut their Bahamas trip short after only 3 days. The luxury resort they couldn't actually afford had charged them early departure fees on top of the original booking costs. Their flights home, changed at the last minute, cost an additional $3,000. But the real damage was happening at home. Christina's family learned about the watch theft within days of Dylan's return. I didn't contact them directly, but Dylan apparently confessed everything during a desperate attempt to explain why he couldn't afford the lifestyle he'd been promising. The Morrison family's response was swift and brutal. Complete social and financial excommunication. Robert Morrison, who had spent months questioning Dylan's ability to provide for his daughter, now had definitive proof of his character. Not only could Dylan not provide for Christina, he would steal from family members to maintain the illusion that he could. The family dinners stopped. The business networking opportunities evaporated. The social connections that had been Christina's lifeline to her previous world disappeared overnight. But worse news was coming. By the end of July, Christina had filed for legal separation. The marriage counseling sessions Dylan had begged for lasted exactly 3 appointments before Christina's attorney advised her to stop discussing their problems with a professional who could be subpoenaed in divorce proceedings. Dylan moved out of their apartment in August, not because Christina asked him to, but because they could no longer afford the rent without my financial support. He found a studio apartment in a part of town where none of their friends would see him, a place small enough that he couldn't invite anyone over, even if he'd had anyone left to invite. Christina filed for divorce in September. The proceedings were swift and merciless. Dylan had no significant assets to split, no property to fight over, no children to complicate custody arrangements. Christina kept her car, her jewelry, her professional connections, and her dignity. Dylan kept his debts. The Morrison family made sure the story spread through their social circles, not maliciously, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough character assessment before marriage. Dylan became a cautionary tale at country club dinners and charity galas, the charming son-in-law who turned out to be a thief. Marriage consequences. The professional consequences followed quickly. Dylan's sales job had always depended partly on his connections through Christina's family. When those connections evaporated, his client base shrank dramatically. His income, already insufficient for the lifestyle he'd been trying to maintain, dropped by almost 40%. By Christmas, Dylan was working 2 jobs, his original sales position during the day and weekend shifts at a retail electronics store. The man who had stolen $18,000 to impress his in-laws was now making $12 an hour selling phone cases to pay rent on a studio apartment. I learned these details not from Dylan directly, but from the private investigator Martha had hired, a professional named Sarah Chen, who continued sending monthly reports even after Martha's death. Martha had prepaid for 2 years of monitoring, wanting to ensure I had accurate information about Dylan's situation rather than relying on his inevitable requests for help. The reports painted a picture of complete social and financial collapse. Dylan's gambling debts, no longer subsidized by family money, had led to harassment from creditors. His credit score had cratered. His professional reputation had been destroyed by association with his personal failures. Dylan lost more than money. But the most devastating consequence wasn't financial, it was psychological. Dylan had spent 3 years building an identity around borrowed wealth, using my resources to present himself as a successful provider. When those resources disappeared, he discovered he had no idea who he actually was underneath the performance. Final consequences realization. The last piece of information in Sarah Chen's reports was perhaps the most telling. Dylan had attempted to contact me 17 times through intermediaries, mutual friends, distant relatives, even Christina's divorce attorney. Each time the message was the same. He wanted to apologize, to make amends, to rebuild our relationship, but each message also included a request for financial assistance. Even at the bottom of his personal and professional collapse, even after losing everything due to his own choices, Dylan still saw me primarily as a source of money rather than a father worthy of genuine remorse. Some lessons cost everything to learn. I wear Martha's Rolex every day now. It fits differently on my wrist than it did on hers. The band needs 2 extra links and the weight feels heavier. But every morning I put it on and remember what she taught me about the difference between love and enabling. The $2.8 million from her insurance policy has done more good than Dylan ever could have imagined. The Martha Whitlock Memorial Fund has provided medical care for 63 children at Children's Hospital, funded research into early cancer detection, and established a scholarship program for young people pursuing careers in healthcare. There's a small plaque in the hospital lobby with Martha's name and a quote she chose herself. Love without boundaries enables destruction. True love sometimes means allowing consequences. Now I understand what Martha meant when she said the most important messages come in the smallest packages. The empty SD card slot in the watch reminds me daily that Martha's final gift wasn't money, it was protection. She saved me from my own generous impulses and taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to save them from themselves. Dylan calls every few months, usually around holidays or his birthday. The conversations are brief and always end with requests for money that I politely decline. He's learned to accept my refusal without argument, but he hasn't learned to call without asking. Maybe someday he will. Maybe someday he'll understand that the love of a parent isn't measured in dollars given, but in boundaries maintained. Maybe he'll realize that Martha didn't take away his inheritance. She gave him the opportunity to build character. Until then, I have Martha's watch, Martha's wisdom, and the peace that comes from knowing I finally learned the lesson she spent 34 years trying to teach me, that love without accountability isn't love at all. Some gifts can only be received when you're strong enough to accept their true weight. And what would you do if you discovered your own child had stolen your spouse's most precious possession? Have you ever had to choose between enabling someone you love and protecting yourself from their destructive choices? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family boundaries, quiet justice, and the courage to love people enough to let them face the consequences of their actions